Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Glad to be here for this one.
Yeah, so I want you to imagine something for a second. Imagine a society that is just completely turned upside down by a sudden, massive influx of wealth.
Oh, yeah. Total upheaval.
Right.
Yeah.
Like people who previously only knew the names of their immediate neighbors, suddenly they're dealing with anonymous strangers in these massive, sprawling commercial hubs.
It's a complete paradigm shift for them.
Exactly. Everyone is constantly trading, talking, arguing, trying to secure their piece of this rapidly expanding pie. I mean, it sounds exactly like the frenzy of a modern tech boom, right?
Oh, absolutely. Or like a rapidly globalizing economy.
Yeah, but we aren't talking about the 21st century at all. We are talking about ancient Israel nearly 3,000 years ago.
Which is wild to think about.
It really is. Today, we are dropping straight into the absolute trenches of the ancient wisdom literature, specifically looking at chapters 10 through 24.
Right, which is a totally different vibe from the earlier chapters.
It really is. We are bypassing all that sweeping philosophical poetry of the early sections, and we are hitting this rapid-fire sequence of staccato maxims.
They're punchy.
Very punchy. So our mission for this deep dive is to act as your guides through this incredibly dense material, extracting the underlying mechanisms of this ancient wisdom so you can actually apply it to your life today.
Yeah, and it is a profound shift in the text. To really grasp why these maxims are so aggressive even, you have to understand the sheer whiplash of the historical context.
Set the scene for us a bit.
Well, these sayings were compiled during a period of unprecedented transition. You have a society moving out of this highly localized, relatively simple agrarian existence.
Where, like, everyone knows everyone.
Exactly. Your reputation was known by everyone in your village. Commerce was mostly, bartering with your cousins. And suddenly, they're thrust into a highly complex, urbanized monarchy.
Wow.
Yeah. Suddenly, there is international trade. There's a centralized bureaucracy.
Right. The stakes are suddenly incredibly high. You aren't just trading a goat for some wheat with a guy you've known since childhood.
No, you're signing complex contracts now.
You are, and you're encountering new philosophies, foreign dignitaries, entirely new ways of living. The sensory overload must have been staggering for these people.
It had to be. And with that urbanization comes the anonymity of the marketplace, which changes everything.
Because people act differently when nobody knows their name.
Precisely. When you deal with strangers, the temptations just multiply.
Yes.
Suddenly, there are opportunities for sudden unearned wealth. There's a completely new level of public discourse happening at the city gates.
So it's basically an ancient public square.
Right. And the text we're looking at is essentially a survival manual. It's for a human being trying to maintain their integrity, their sanity, and really their soul when the world around them has suddenly hit the accelerator.
It diagnoses the pressures that reveal human character flaws.
It does. It acts like a stress test for the human condition.
And that is exactly why this ancient text feels so uncomfortably relevant to us. Because, the specific technologies have changed. We're trading digital currency instead of physical silver.
Right.
And we are arguing in global comment sections instead of at the literal city gates. But the underlying human operating system, that hasn't had an update in 3 millennia.
Not a single update.
Yeah. The ego, the appetite, the fear, the desire for status, it is all exactly the same.
It really is.
So we are going to look at how these chapters address 4 foundational pillars of your life. The way you communicate, the way you conduct your work, the way you govern your internal emotions, and how you curate your community.
Which naturally begins with speech. I mean, it's the most immediate, visible output of our internal architecture.
The first thing people notice.
Exactly. If you want to know what is happening inside a person, you look at what they're broadcasting to the outside world. And this text places an almost terrifying weight on human communication.
Terrifying is the right word. It doesn't view speech as casual or transient at all. The core insight running through these chapters is that words hold the literal biological power of life and death.
Yeah, the text explicitly states that death and life are in the power of the tongue.
And then there's that classic line about how a soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger.
Which is so profoundly true. Our sources, especially the commentary from Matthew Henry, dive really deep into this. Henry notes that the words of the righteous are compared to choice silver when they're used properly.
Choice silver, so they have real, tangible value.
Exactly. They aren't just empty sounds. They have intrinsic, measurable worth. He also makes this brilliant psychological observation. He says, hard arguments do best with soft words.
Hard arguments do best with soft words. I love that.
It's a masterclass in persuasion, really. If your goal is actually to change a mind or to resolve a deep conflict, the friction of a harsh delivery will completely override the logic of your argument.
Because people just get defensive.
Right. The recipient's ego instantly builds a defensive wall against the perceived attack, and your hard argument, no matter how logical, will just bounce right off.
But a soft delivery bypasses that ego defense entirely.
It slips right past it.
Let's bring this into the reality of your daily life, though, because we are navigating an era defined by what the text calls the multitude of words.
Oh, yeah. We are drowning in words.
We really are. The ancient wisdom says that in the multitude of words, sin is unavoidable. Now think about the sheer volume of text, speech, and broadcasting we engage in today.
It's nonstop.
It is. We are endlessly texting, firing off emails, posting on social media, sitting in virtual meetings. We are generating more words per capita in a single week than our ancestors might have generated in a lifetime.
And that is exactly where the ancient warning becomes a direct, almost aggressive challenge to our modern culture.
How so?
Well, we live in an attention economy that explicitly incentivizes the hot take. The algorithms that govern our digital lives, they reward immediate, highly emotional, rapid-fire responses.
Right. The angrier the tweet, the more engagement it gets.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We are conditioned to overshare and to broadcast unformed thoughts the second they enter our heads.
Which is dangerous.
Very. The ancient text is arguing that sheer volume is a massive vulnerability. When words multiply without an internal filter, you inevitably stumble into folly, misrepresentation, or, outright cruelty.
Okay, but I want to push back on this a little, or at least play out the modern counter-argument here.
Sure, let's hear it.
Because if I look at our current culture, the advice to give a soft answer or to hold back your words, it feels like a recipe for getting steamrolled.
It can definitely feel that way.
Right. We value the quick, witty clapback. If someone attacks your reputation professionally or comes at you in a public digital forum, the absolute expectation is that you fire back instantly to control the narrative.
You have to defend your brand.
Exactly. Doesn't holding back mean you are essentially surrendering? It feels like you're walking into a gladiatorial arena where the audience demands blood, and you are just standing there refusing to draw your sword.
That is a highly accurate description of the modern arena. And it highlights the exact obstacle to growth that the text identifies.
Which is what?
The human ego.
That.
Specifically, the ego's relentless, almost infantile demand for immediate vindication. The ego screams that silence equals defeat.
It does feel like defeat.
But let's look at the mechanism described in the text. It points out that a fool shows his annoyance the same day, but a prudent person overlooks an insult.
Notice the time frame there, the same day.
Yes. The fool operates entirely on reflex. The stimulus of the insult immediately triggers the response of annoyance. There's literally no gap between the two.
They are completely enslaved to the provocation.
Precisely. They have no autonomy. The prudent person, however, possesses the internal architecture to create a gap.
A gap between the insult and the reaction.
Right. They have the strength to defer their reaction, to actually overlook the slight in the moment. The text is arguing that true power doesn't lie in the clapback. True power is the autonomy of restraint.
That's a huge paradigm shift.
It is. Matthew Henry's commentary points out that a prating fool falls precisely because they are full of talk, but empty of sense.
So they're just making noise.
Yeah. When you engage in that instant reflexive counterattack, you aren't demonstrating strength to the audience. You're demonstrating to anyone with actual wisdom that you have absolutely no control over your own spirit.
You're a puppet. And the person who insulted you is pulling the strings.
Exactly. You've handed them the remote control to your emotions.
Wow, that really reframes the entire concept of winning an argument. You win by retaining your autonomy, by not taking the bait. But let's get granular here, because the sources go into fascinating detail about the specific types of speech that destroy communities.
Oh, they definitely do.
Let's look at the talebearer, which is the ancient term for the gossip. The text says the words of a gossip are like dainty morsels that go down into a person's innermost parts.
That's such a visceral biological image.
It is, and it maps perfectly onto modern neuroscience. Why does the text call gossip a dainty morsel? Because consuming it feels exceptionally good in the moment.
It's a confection.
Right. When we receive exclusive negative information about a rival or a peer, we get a literal dopamine hit. It feels like social currency. We feel elevated because someone else is being lowered.
It's junk food for the soul. It tastes amazing on the way down, but it creates a profound sickness over time.
That is exactly it. Henry notes that tale-bearing breaks the fundamental unwritten laws of human conversation and friendship. It acts as a solvent on trust.
And trust is the only glue that holds a complex society together.
Absolutely. Another commentator we're looking at, Albert Barnes, adds a brilliant layer to this. He says that true faithfulness in a job or a relationship means operating without garrulity.
Garrulity, meaning excessive, trivial, or rambling talk.
Right. In a society that is constantly interacting, the person who can actually receive sensitive information and let it stop with them, the person who can keep their mouth shut becomes an incredibly rare and valuable asset.
They become a vault.
Yeah. And the text doesn't just focus on the negative either. It offers a really potent alternative. It mentions that pleasant words are like a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones.
The ancients really didn't just view words as transferring information, did they?
No, they viewed them as having a physiological impact. They observed that pleasant, encouraging, truthful words act as actual literal medicine for a broken spirit.
That's beautiful.
Think about the last time you were totally overwhelmed, maybe dealing with a massive failure at work, and someone you deeply respect pulled you aside and spoke a few specific measured words of belief in you.
Oh, you can physically feel the tension? Leave your nervous system. Your posture literally changes. The words alter your biology.
That is the profound mechanism at play here. Our speech literally shapes the emotional reality of the people around us. We are either injecting toxins or we're administering medicine.
So how does a modern listener actually apply this ancient restraint?
Well, you have to build an artificial gap between stimulus and response. Think of it as the practice of the 24-hour deferral.
I know so many people, myself absolutely included, who need this tattooed on their forearms.
Oh, me too.
How do we operationalize this deferral, though?
It requires intense discipline. When you receive that provocative email that makes your blood boil, or that passive-aggressive comment in a family group text, or when you feel the overwhelming urge to weigh in on a public controversy online, you intentionally enforce a 24-hour embargo on your response.
A total blackout.
Exactly. You draft the reply if you absolutely must, but you do not hit send. And during that 24-hour pause, you force yourself to reflect on the contrast between words that are like a piercing sword and words that bring healing.
You have to sit with that drafted response.
Yeah, you sit with it and you ask yourself a brutally honest question. Is this a piercing sword? Is the primary purpose of these words to wound the other person and vindicate my own ego?
Wow.
Or is this response designed to bring healing, clarity, and resolution to the situation? And if it's a sword, you delete it.
The terrifying thing about that practice is realizing how much of our daily communication is entirely sword-based.
It's staggering.
We justify it as just being honest or setting the record straight,
Yeah.
but the underlying mechanism is just ego vindication.
Exactly. If you actually enforce the 24-hour deferral, you realize that most of the things you felt an absolute burning necessity to say on Tuesday, they feel completely irrelevant by Wednesday.
Which proves that the urgency was entirely manufactured by the ego, not by the actual demands of wisdom.
That is a perfect transition, honestly, because if words are the currency of our relationships, our daily labor and our resources are the currency of our society.
Right.
This brings us from the marketplace of ideas to the literal marketplace. We're looking at the economics of wisdom now: work, wealth, and generosity.
And this is where that historical context of a booming, rapidly urbanizing economy becomes absolutely central to understanding the text.
Yeah, set that up for us.
The text introduces a foundational, non-negotiable economic principle right out of the gate. It says that a false balance is an abomination.
Now, to understand the gravity of that, we have to look at the physical reality of ancient commerce, right?
We do. Albert Barnes notes that this refers to a time when actual physical stones were used as weights in these growing commercial hubs.
Right, so picture the scene. You go to the market to buy grain. The merchant has a physical scale. He puts your silver on one side, and he puts a standardized stone weight on the other to determine how much grain you get.
Exactly. But the deceit lies in the stones themselves.
Tell me about the stones.
So Matthew Henry expands on this, explaining the concept of diverse weights. A corrupt merchant would have 2 sets of stones hidden in his pouch.
Wow. 2 sets?
Yeah. He would have a scanty or slightly lighter stone that he uses when he's selling to you. That way, you get less product than you actually paid for.
A subtle ripoff.
Right. And then he'd have a heavy stone that he uses when he's buying from you, so he gets more product for his money. It's an invisible, incremental theft.
And Henry points out that this represents all forms of fraudulent commerce, doesn't he?
He does. And notice the extreme language the text uses here. It doesn't just say a false balance is bad for the economy or frowned upon.
No, it calls it an abomination.
An abomination.
Yeah.
That word signifies deep, visceral disgust.
So the wisdom tradition here is making a radical claim. True religion isn't just confined to what happens in a temple or during a ritual. It demands absolute, microscopic ethical integrity in the marketplace.
Yes, the divine is presented as the patron of justice, deeply and personally offended by systemic deceit in commerce.
No. When we translate that false stone weight into the 21st century, it becomes incredibly clarifying.
It really does.
Think about the invisible thefts in modern business. It's the hidden fees that are intentionally buried in the terms of service.
Oh, I hate those. Right.
Or it's the subscription model that is designed to be deliberately difficult to cancel.
The dark patterns in web design.
Exactly. It's shrinkflation, where a company subtly reduces the volume of a product while keeping the packaging and the price exactly the same.
That is exactly a modern scanty stone.
It is. Or think about the professional services world billing a client for hours you didn't actually work. Or maybe exaggerating the capabilities of a software product to close a sale, knowing full well the tech team can't actually deliver it.
Those are all mechanisms of exploitation. They rely entirely on the ignorance or the trust of the other party.
And the text suggests that engaging in these practices rots the very foundation of a society.
It breaks that trust we talked about earlier.
But we need to exercise some serious discernment here. Because if you read these chapters quickly, you can walk away with a severe misunderstanding.
How so?
Well, the text frequently pairs diligence with wealth. For instance, it says that someone becomes poor who works with a lazy hand, but the hand of the diligent brings wealth.
Oh, right.
To a modern ear, especially in our current cultural climate, that sounds suspiciously like an ancient prosperity gospel.
Like karma, almost.
Right. The idea that if you are just a good, hardworking, moral person, you're guaranteed to get rich. And if you are poor, it must be because you're lazy or you lack character.
Which is a very dangerous assumption.
It is. So how do we navigate that? Does the text actually endorse that kind of binary thinking?
That's a critical question. And we have to read the text holistically to avoid that exact trap.
What's the expert consensus from our sources?
The consensus clarifies that verses pairing diligence with wealth are observing general natural consequences.
Okay, as a broad rule.
Yes. As a broad rule, in a functioning society, disciplined, focused labor tends to yield resources. And chronic laziness tends to yield poverty. It's an observable sociological principle.
But it's not a magical guarantee.
Not at all. However, the text actively and aggressively critiques the human tendency to trust in wealth. It is absolutely not a blind endorsement of getting rich as the ultimate goal of human existence.
In fact, the warnings about wealth in this section are actually quite haunting.
They are. One proverb paints this vivid picture, warning that riches sprout wings like an eagle and fly into the sky.
Wealth is fundamentally transient.
Exactly. Another line bluntly states that wealth profits nothing in the day of wrath, meaning when the ultimate crises of life hit terminal illness, the loss of a loved one, or massive societal collapse, your bank account is entirely useless.
It can't save you.
Right. Furthermore, the text explicitly and repeatedly condemns wealth that is gained through exploitation. It's not just about the final number on your balance sheet.
Right, the ends don't justify the means.
Ancient wisdom is entirely concerned with how you acquired the resources and what you intend to do with them once you have them.
I want to look at a very specific mechanism of wealth accumulation that the text targets because it is hyper-relevant today.
Okay, let's hear it.
There's a line that says, "He that withholdeth corn, the people shall curse him, but blessing shall be upon the head of him that selleth it."
Oh, wow.
Now, map that onto modern supply chain ethics. Think about the early days of a global crisis, where we see individuals and corporations hoarding essential supplies.
Hand sanitizer, masks.
Exactly. Whether it's medical equipment, basic foodstuffs, or even digital resources, they hoard them to artificially inflate the price and gouge the public.
The parallels are exact. In the ancient world, one of the most ruthless ways to consolidate wealth was to buy up grain during a slight shortage.
And just sit on it.
Yeah, hoard it in your storehouses while the famine worsens. You wait until public desperation reaches a fever pitch, and then you sell it back to them at exorbitant, ruinous prices.
You are literally monetizing human starvation.
You are. And Henry points out that human beings inherently hate this kind of selfishness. The underlying principle here is that capital and resources must ultimately serve the community.
So if your entire business model relies on exploiting the suffering, the deprivation, or the desperation of others, it is fundamentally unwise.
It invites the curse of the people, which the text views as a direct reflection of divine displeasure.
It's the ultimate failure of stewardship. And the text contrasts that hoarding mentality with a concept it calls the liberal soul.
Yes, this is a beautiful concept.
It presents this incredible, mathematically impossible paradox. Listen to this. There is one who scatters and increases yet more. There is one who withholds more than is appropriate, but gains poverty.
It's so counterintuitive.
Right. If you take that to a modern financial advisor operating on a strict zero-sum economic model, they will tell you that makes absolutely no sense. How does giving your money away make you richer? How does holding on to it make you poor?
It is a profound comparative insight, and it challenges the core assumptions of a scarcity mindset.
Explain that.
Well, in a zero-sum game, my gain must exactly equal your loss. If I have $1 and I give it to you, I am literally $1 poorer. But ancient wisdom operates on a completely different paradigm.
It posits that generous scattering actually increases wealth.
Now, we must be careful here. This isn't necessarily a promise of immediate material return, though it can be.
It's not a slot machine.
Right. It's often about the increase of communal wealth, relational capital, and spiritual vitality. But look at the metaphor being used. Scattering. It is an agricultural metaphor.
The farmer in the field.
Exactly. When a farmer walks through a plowed field and scatters seed, to an alien observer who doesn't understand biology, it looks like madness.
Like they're just throwing food into the dirt.
Yes. The farmer's taking perfectly good edible grain and just throwing it away. It looks like pure waste. But the farmer understands the mechanism of the harvest.
They know that scattering the seed, letting it die in the soil, is the only possible way to reap a multiplied crop.
Right. If the farmer decides to be fiscally conservative and hoards all the seed in the barn to protect his assets, he guarantees that he will starve the following year.
The hoarding ensures the poverty. That is amazing.
It is. Matthew Henry's commentary beautifully notes that the liberal soul is literally translated as the soul that blesses. It is a fundamental disposition toward the world.
By cheerfully using our resources, our time, and our expertise to relieve and elevate others, we are watered ourselves.
We build a robust community that will act as a safety net in our own time of inevitable need.
We gain a reputation for integrity that attracts opportunity. So when you are listening to this, maybe on your commute or at your desk, you need to invite this ancient text to perform a rigorous audit on your professional life.
A self-audit is so necessary.
Think about the mechanisms of your industry. Ask yourself, what are the false balances of my specific workplace? Am I participating in systems that rely on an invisible thumb on the scale?
Am I taking advantage of someone's ignorance?
Exactly. And on the flip side, examine your disposition toward generosity. Am I hoarding my resources? Am I guarding my expertise so no one else can threaten my position?
Am I taking all the credit for a team's success?
Yes. Or am I a liberal soul who scatters seed and waters the people around me? The text insists that your economic behavior is a primary diagnostic of your internal health.
Which is the perfect bridge to our next pillar.
The internal landscape.
Exactly. Because if we mismanage our words, acting as talebearers, and if we mismanage our wealth, utilizing false balances, we are failing in the external, visible arenas of life.
But what is the root cause of those external failures? What actually drives a person to gossip or to cheat?
That brings us to emotional architecture, the management of self-control, anger, and envy.
This is where the text gets incredibly psychological and honestly quite invasive. We've looked at what we say and what we do, and now we are pulling back the floorboards to look at why we say and do it.
It's the engine room.
It is. And the core non-negotiable wisdom here is the absolute necessity of ruling one's own spirit.
The pinnacle of this entire concept is found in a maxim that declares, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, one who rules his spirit than he who takes a city."
We need to pause and feel the weight of that image, taking a walled city.
In the ancient Near East, taking a walled, fortified city was the absolute zenith of human achievement. It required immense strategic brilliance, logistical mastery, brute strength, and political power.
It was how kings secured their legacy.
Exactly. The text is making a staggering claim here. Conquering your own volatile internal emotions is a harder, greater, and more glorious victory than conquering a physical empire.
You know, it makes me think of Alexander the Great.
Oh, perfect example.
He conquered the known world before he was 33. He took countless walled cities, but historical accounts suggest he died after a massive drinking binge, having murdered one of his closest friends in a fit of drunken rage.
Wow.
Right. He conquered the globe, but his internal architecture completely collapsed. He could take a city, but he couldn't rule his spirit.
That is a brilliant historical illustration of the concept. True mastery is internal.
But I want to introduce some serious modern friction here.
Bring it on.
Because if you look at the landscape of pop psychology and modern self-help over the last few decades, the prevailing wisdom often points in the exact opposite direction.
And it tells us to let it all out.
Constantly, we are told that we shouldn't bottle up our emotions. We are told that if you feel anger, you need to express it, you need to process it outwardly so it doesn't become toxic.
The steam kettle analogy.
Yes, the steam kettle. If you don't let the steam out, the kettle explodes. So isn't this ancient command to rule your spirit essentially advocating for unhealthy emotional repression?
That tension right there is perhaps the biggest obstacle for a modern listener engaging with this
It
text.
feels very repressive.
Well, we live in a culture that deeply romanticizes passion and authenticity. We operate on the assumption that whatever we feel in the moment is our truest self. And to suppress it is to be inauthentic.
Like if I scream at my colleague, well, that's just because I'm passionate about the project.
Right. But the ancient text completely rejects that framework. It views unbridled emotional expression not as authenticity, but as a dangerous lack of structural integrity.
Okay, so address the kennel analogy then.
Let's look at the actual analogy the text uses. It says the beginning of strife is like breaching a dam.
Oh, a breached dam is a vastly different scenario than a whistling tea kettle.
Completely different. A kettle letting off steam is harmless. It just dissipates into the air. Breaching a dam is a catastrophic, self-perpetuating event.
It destroys everything in its path.
Matthew Henry's commentary points out the mechanics of this. When you let that first surge of unchecked, unruled anger out, one hot word begets another.
It's a chain reaction.
Yes. The water doesn't just trickle out nicely. The pressure of the water violently washes away the very earth and stone that was holding it back.
The breach widens exponentially.
Exponentially by the second, until you have an unstoppable flood that destroys the valley below, washing away relationships, careers, and the foundation of your own life.
So the text is absolutely not advocating for pretending you don't feel anger.
No, not at all. It's advocating for mastery over the anger, ensuring the dam holds so the emotion doesn't wash away your existence.
And the sources go into fascinating, almost medical detail about the physical toll of failing to maintain that dam.
They do.
It's not just that your anger ruins your relationships, it actually ruins your biology. There's this incredibly evocative phrase in the text, envy rots the bones.
It's such a striking image.
What did the ancients mean by that, and how does it hold up today?
It holds up remarkably well under the scrutiny of modern science. Henry points out that malice, envy, and greed act as a literal physical consumption of the flesh.
They are profoundly psychosomatic.
Yes. The ancients observed that people who harbor deep resentments, people who are constantly consumed with envy over their neighbor's wealth or status, seem to physically wither.
They didn't have MRI machines or blood tests, but they could see the rotting of the bones.
Exactly. And today, we understand the exact mechanism. When you harbor chronic anger or envy, your amygdala is constantly firing, keeping your body in a perpetual state of fight or flight.
You are literally flooding your system with cortisol and adrenaline.
Every single day. And chronic cortisol exposure suppresses your immune system, increases inflammation, degrades your cardiovascular health, and literally shortens your telomeres, the caps on your DNA.
Wow.
So the ancient poetic image of bones rotting is a scientifically accurate description of what chronic stress does to the human body. Your lack of emotional architecture is killing you from the inside out.
And it isn't just anger and envy that breach the dam. The text also looks at the failure of self-control through the lens of pure appetite, specifically addiction.
Ah, yes. The passage on addiction is brutal.
There is this haunting, darkly satirical passage that describes the profound loss of self.
It paints a devastating portrait of alcoholism, but honestly, it applies to any addiction that dethrones the intellect.
Describe that portrait for us.
It describes a drunkard who is completely untethered from reality. He is having hallucinations. He is physically beaten and bruised, perhaps from a fight or a fall. But because of the substance, he feels no pain in the moment.
He's totally numb.
Numb and oblivious. The text says he is like a man trying to sleep on the top of a ship's mast in the middle of a violent storm.
Just precarious.
He is in mortal, imminent danger, and he is completely oblivious to it.
And the most tragic part of that entire sequence is the punchline at the very end.
The waking up.
Yes. The drunkard finally wakes up, the anesthesia wears off, he realizes he is battered, his life is a mess, and what is his very first conscious thought?
I will look for more.
Exactly. When will I wake up? I will look for more. The appetite has completely conquered the spirit. The city has fallen.
It is the ultimate depiction of a surrendered will.
So how do we build the wall? How do we fortify the dam before the city falls?
You need to engage in a continuous internal audit.
Internal audit, how does that work?
Well, when you feel those powerful emotional surges, whether it's a sudden spike of wrath at a driver cutting you off, a creeping cold envy when you see a peer's promotion on LinkedIn, or the overwhelming, numbing urge to pour another drink or doom scroll for another hour.
You have to interrupt it.
You must pause. You must force the intellect to audit the appetite. You ask yourself, am I building a high gate seeking destruction?
Meaning, am I puffing myself up? Am I indulging this emotion just to feed my ego, knowing full well it's going to destabilize my life?
Exactly. You audit the emotion, not to deny that you are feeling it, but to decide in that critical gap between stimulus and response, whether you are going to let the emotion rule you or whether you're going to rule it.
You choose whether to reinforce the dam or let it breach.
It's an active choice.
That is profound. And it brings us to the final and arguably most complex arena of human experience.
Or relationships.
Yes, the social fabric. Friendship, family, and how to deal with fools. Because if we manage our internal emotions well, if our dam is secure and we aren't constantly flooding our own lives with anger or envy, we're finally equipped to actually engage with other humans.
This is where all the previous wisdom culminates. You cannot possibly build a healthy social fabric if your words are piercing swords, if your business practices are fraudulent, and if your internal emotions are volatile.
You'll just destroy everyone around you.
Precisely. The core wisdom of this section is the immense, life-altering importance of choosing the right company.
Because the ancients understood that human beings are highly porous, right?
We absorb the qualities of our environment. We literally become the people we associate with.
It's the ancient blueprint for that modern adage that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with.
Exactly. Your income, your health habits, your vocabulary, they all regress to the mean of your immediate peer group.
And the text states it with terrifying simplicity. One who walks with wise men grows wise, but a companion of fools suffers harm.
Notice the phrasing there. It doesn't say the companion of fools might suffer harm or that they will slowly try to make the fools better.
No, it's a guarantee.
It says they will suffer harm. The company you keep is not a neutral environment. It is an active, shaping source.
Now, as we navigate these relationships, particularly within the family structure, we have to confront a part of the text that requires immense discernment.
Yes. This is a tricky area for modern readers.
Because the language used here is highly abrasive to modern sensibilities. I'm talking about the repeated advice to smite the scorner or to use the rod of discipline on children.
The physical discipline passages.
Right. There are lines about sparing the rod and hating the child, or the rod of correction driving foolishness out. How on earth do we read this today without just completely recoiling? How do we separate the ancient cultural context from the actual enduring wisdom?
This is a vital exercise in critical thinking, and it's exactly why we must read carefully. We have to distinguish the enduring principle of the text from the ancient method of the culture.
Okay, unpack the method first.
In the ancient Near East, physical, corporal punishment was the absolute, unquestioned standard for education, legal discipline, and family management.
It was just what everyone did.
It was the ubiquitous medium of the era. If we get hung up on the method, we miss the profound psychological principle beneath it.
And what's the principle?
Matthew Henry's commentary provides the key here. He notes that the principle is about course-correcting destructive behavior before vicious habits harden into permanent character traits.
Catching it early.
Yes. He uses the analogy of a tree. The branch is easily bent when it is tender.
So the goal was never the infliction of physical pain. The goal was the necessary intervention. The pain was just the crude mechanism they had at the time.
Exactly. The text is making a radical argument about the nature of love.
How so?
It argues that it is an act of deep, profound love to hold someone accountable, to provide firm boundaries, and to enforce actual consequences when a child or even a peer or an employee is heading down a path that will ultimately destroy them.
It's loving them enough to stop them.
Yes. To let someone you love run wild into ruin simply because you are too cowardly, too concerned with being their friend, or too lazy to engage in the exhausting work of discipline that, according to this wisdom, is a functional form of hatred.
Because you're letting them destroy themselves just to spare yourself the discomfort of a confrontation?
Precisely. Modern psychology and pedagogy offer us vastly superior, nonviolent, and more effective tools for discipline and boundary setting today.
We absolutely leave the ancient method behind.
We do. But the ancient principle that true love requires firm, sometimes painful accountability remains an absolute necessity for human flourishing.
That makes total sense. We keep the core truth at accountability, but we update the methodology. It's the difference between ignoring a problem to keep the peace and enduring the friction of a hard conversation to actually save the relationship.
Exactly that.
Let's look at the one that compares a beautiful woman who lacks discretion to a jewel of gold in a swine's snout.
It is such a jarring, bizarre metaphor.
It really is. What is the context there?
It's brilliant in its absurdity. Albert Barnes notes the cultural context here. In ancient Syria, swine were commonly fitted with physical rings in their snouts to prevent them from rooting around in the mud and destroying gardens.
Oh, okay. So the ring had a practical purpose.
But the metaphor takes something of immense refined value, a jewel of pure gold, and places it in the epicenter of filth and base behavior.
Right, on a pig.
The text is highlighting how outward beauty, immense talent, or magnetic charisma is completely misplaced and ultimately absurd if it is not matched by internal moral tact.
Discretion.
Yes. Discretion is the ultimate meta skill. It is the ability to judge what is appropriate, to read a room, to have taste, empathy, and moral sense.
And without it?
Without discretion, all the outward beauty or talent in the world is just a gold ring on a pig digging in the garbage.
Honestly, that is a surgically precise description of so much of our modern celebrity and influencer culture.
It really is.
We, as a society, we constantly elevate the gold ring. We worship the talent, the aesthetics, the wealth, and we completely ignore the absolute lack of discretion.
And then we act shocked when these people's lives publicly implode.
We value the aesthetic over the architecture.
Perfectly said. And speaking of toxic personalities, the text gives us a very specific psychological profile of a person we must actively avoid.
The scorner.
The scorner.
Who exactly is the scorner? Because it sounds like more than just someone having a bad day or someone who's just a bit grumpy.
Oh, it's a deep character flaw.
Okay.
Matthew Henry defines the scorner as the ultimate cynic.
The ultimate cynic.
This is the person who sows constant discord. They banter and abuse mankind. They mock everything and respect absolutely nothing.
So in a modern context, this is the person in the boardroom who shoots down every single idea with weaponized irony, but never offers a constructive solution of their own.
Exactly. They are entirely unteachable because their cynicism convinces them that they are already smarter than everyone else in the room.
They use mockery as a shield against vulnerability.
They do.
And what is the ancient prescription for dealing with the scorner? Do we try to win them over with our soft words? Do we try to rehabilitate them?
The text is uncompromising here. It says, "Cast out the scorner, and contention shall go out. Yea, strife and reproach shall cease."
Just cast them out.
You cannot reason with a scorner. You cannot appease them. You cannot outlogic their cynicism.
So it's an amputation.
The only solution is decisive amputation. You simply have to remove them from your inner circle, your team, or your community, or their toxic irony will poison the entire culture.
Wow. But the text isn't just a list of people to avoid, right? It also paints a beautiful, enduring picture of what true connection looks like.
It does. It says there is a friend that sticketh closer than a brother.
It acknowledges that blood is not always thicker than water.
Right. Sometimes the family we intentionally choose, the people we bind ourselves to through shared values and shared trials, form a stronger bond than our biological family.
Which is such a comforting thought for a lot of people.
Yes, but the caveat, as Henry warns, is that to have friends like that, you must show yourself friendly.
It's active.
Deep friendship is not an accident. It is an achievement. It requires immense, intentional investment.
It requires everything we have talked about today, doesn't it?
All of it. The soft words to turn away wrath, the liberal soul to share resources, and the emotional control to not breach the dam when you inevitably hurt each other.
So, as you look at your own social fabric, you need to do a relationship reflection. Look closely at your inner circle. Are you tolerating a scorner?
Is there someone whose constant cynicism and mockery is paralyzing your growth?
And do you need to make the incredibly uncomfortable choice to cast them out of your immediate orbit?
It's hard, but necessary.
And on the flip side, are you investing deeply in the friends who stick closer than family? Are you doing the hard work of showing yourself friendly?
It is the work of a lifetime.
It really is. So let's pull all these threads together. We have journeyed through the bustling, overwhelming ancient streets of this wisdom literature, and we have seen that the foundational mechanisms of human flourishing haven't changed one bit in 3,000 years.
Not one bit.
We've learned that our words must be meticulously measured, deferred when necessary, and used as medicine rather than swords.
Right.
We've seen that our daily work and our wealth must be pursued with microscopic integrity, rejecting the false balance, and shared with a liberal soul that scatters seed.
The scattering is key.
We've explored the absolute necessity of ruling our internal spirits, fortifying the dam against the floodwaters of anger and envy.
Ruling the city.
And finally, we've seen that our communities must be carefully curated, holding loved ones to painful accountability while ruthlessly casting out the toxic cynic.
It is a comprehensive, brilliant blueprint for living. But I want to leave the listener with one final haunting image to ponder on their own.
Okay, what is it?
It's drawn from the very end of this section. In chapter 24, it is the vivid description of the field of the sluggard.
Walk us through that scene. What does it look like?
The author describes walking past the field of a lazy man, the vineyard of someone who lacks understanding. And he looks over the property.
And it's a mess, I'm assuming.
A total mess. The stone wall, which was meant to protect the crop, is broken down. The ground is completely covered with thorns, and the entire surface is overgrown with stinging nettles.
Just total ruin.
Total ruin. Now, here is the profound, terrifying tragedy of this image. The sluggard did not actively destroy his own field.
He didn't go out with a sledgehammer and smash his own wall.
No. He didn't intentionally plant the weed seeds. He didn't actively sabotage his life. What did he do? The text says he simply folded his hands to sleep. He just wanted a little slumber.
So his only crime was inaction.
Exactly. And the thought to mull over as you go about your week is this. Entropy is the natural physical state of the universe.
Things naturally break down.
Weeds naturally grow. Walls naturally crumble under the weight of time and weather.
If you do nothing, nature takes it back.
Yes. If you are not actively, daily, intentionally applying wisdom to your life, if you're not actively managing your words, actively auditing your finances, actively fortifying your emotional dam, and actively tending to your friendships,
they will naturally overgrow with thorns.
They will. Wisdom is not a passive state that you achieve and then just maintain on autopilot. It requires relentless active cultivation.
If you simply fold your hands and do nothing, your life will be reclaimed by the weeds.
You don't have to choose to destroy your life. You just have to choose not to maintain it.
That is an incredibly motivating image. You really have to tend the garden. That's the heart of this section. This is wisdom for the present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.